We're now in this era of ag tech that has moved from just data collection and dashboards to now automated processes that can take a lot of the friction out of using these digital tools on the farm.
Managing any additional technology on top of their already busy job, it takes some work, right? It takes some bandwidth. So if we can use automation to help reduce that bandwidth requirement for the growers, it really helps them to adopt that technology at larger scale.
That's Arthur Chen, CEO of Verdi. Their platform enables specialty crop growers to automate their irrigation systems. And it's really starting to gain traction, especially with large enterprise growers of grapes, tree crops, and other fruits and vegetables.
We're working with a lot of these household names in food and ag. This past year, we've seen about 30x growth in terms of our traction, and we now have growers expanding to thousands of acres with our systems, some of them just putting it on 100% of their operations. So that's been really exciting to see.
But how does this young company plan to succeed where so many others in ag tech have failed? And what's the potential impact of more adoption of variable rate irrigation?
We started in more of the high end of just, the wine industry, but we've really started broadening now into more commodity fruits, nuts, and vegetables.
Arthur Chen of Verdi talks about growing a precision irrigation startup on today's Future of Agriculture podcast. Well, hello, fellow ag nerd. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of the Future of Agriculture. My name is Tim Hammerich, and every week you and I get to hear from the farmers, founders, innovators, investors, the people shaping the future of the ag industry. I'm very pleased that this quarter, the Future of Agriculture podcast, is brought to you by our quarterly presenting sponsor, which is SwapMaps. Because when you know more, you grow more. SwapMaps variable rate technology helps you understand the why of field variability and how to better manage it. Understanding soils is the core of a successful fertility program, and SwapMaps allows you to map, measure, and better manage your soils using data that accurately delineates areas with similar fertilizer response characteristics. SwapMaps, they do variable rate right. Learn more at swapmaps.com. Book a consultation or just check out more information. That's swapmaps.com. But you don't have to take just my word for it. Listen to Tyler Kessler talk about how SwapMaps opened his eyes to the potential of variable rate and how it's worked for him as both a farmer and agronomy consultant working in southern Saskatchewan.
I started being introduced into SwapMaps, and that really was the kind of the turning point of where I believed it started to make sense for me. I could see it started making sense for the clients, and it was the base layer of if you're actually dealing with physical properties. You're not dealing with just yield maps. You're not dealing with imagery to try and market a scalable business. In our case, we've got 99% retention. Anyone that has tried it continues to increase their acres and they want more.
You'll hear more from Tyler there in a new segment I'm going to be debuting just a couple of days called Field Reports, highlighting how innovation is working from the perspective of the user. So stay subscribed to the show for that. All right, now back to today's featured conversation with Arthur Chen of Verdi. Verdi is helping to climate-proof agriculture with the world's first scalable platform to personalize healthcare for plants, helping the world's largest food brands radically optimize farm productivity and sustainability. As you'll hear, they're mostly focused in high-value crops, starting in vines and grapes and then moving into trees and other fruit and vegetable crops. Prior to Verdi, Arthur conducted precision agriculture research sponsored by Mineral at Google X. Arthur and I are going to talk about variable rate irrigation in general, gaining traction as a new ag tech company, and how technology like Verdi's can make an impact on the future of agriculture. I'll drop you into the conversation here where Arthur's providing some context on variable rate irrigation in high-value crops.
So basically the way it works, and the kind of technical farming term for this is really doing variable rate irrigation or fertigation. So you've probably heard of companies that can do see and spray. That's called variable rate spraying. So you drive like a tractor or a robot through a field. You see something, a pest in the field, you can spray it, or a weed, for example. And so we're doing something, similar in principle, but of course, if you do it for irrigation and, fertilization, you need to really change up the way it works. So there's this software component that can help do that analysis and intelligence, and also this hardware component where we can physically do that delivery. So we start with the software side. We analyze satellite and environmental data to create prescription maps for farms. And so once we have these prescriptions, we can then split fields into much smaller zones for precision crop management according to things like soil type, the type of elevation, crop variety, and other factors. And then once we have that, we can then retrofit fleets of our intelligent devices to existing irrigation infrastructure to bring it online and control tiny valves for targeted water and fertilizer delivery. So with these fleets of devices, each device is actually quite small. It fits in the palm of your hand, and it contains special algorithms for automation, networking, and battery management as well. So all you do is you retrofit this, you cut your existing drip tube, for example, you fit it in, and that allows growers to then do variable rate and control different sections of their irrigation system separately from each other. So with a traditional irrigation block, for example, let's say you're growing in an orchard, 100 acres will be controlled by a single large valve on a farm. But we can break that down so that now, maybe every single acre can be uniquely controlled by a separate valve or a separate actuator for the grower.
Okay, so many questions here. So for those listening who maybe are not familiar with vineyards and orchards, drip irrigation is how a lot of them are irrigated. I imagine it probably works with micro sprinklers as well.
Yeah, exactly. So pretty much anything that has tubes on it, we can retrofit to. And we've actually started bringing it to some of the larger diameter pipes too. So some of the more block level control as well.
Okay, great. And what you're referring to as devices, are those essentially smart valves?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so they're really, the best way to think about them is they're controllers. So they can control valves, but we don't actually make the valves ourselves. Those are basically just third-party valves, very common for growers to have. But we have controllers. So each device can connect up to 2 valves. They can actually connect up to 2 sensors as well that are third-party. So you can get this sort of closed feedback loop right in the field.
Explain more about that closed feedback loop in the field. So you're talking about flow meters?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you can put flow meters, for example, on every single controller, so you can see when the valve opens and closes. The funny thing is we've actually had growers use that just to see if their irrigators are irrigating according to schedule as well, which is always kind of interesting for them. And when we say closed feedback loop, we mean that not only can growers control things in the field, but they can actually collect the data and actually right in the field itself, the device makes the decision to open or close the valve for water and fertilizer. So they can get automation right on top of these devices within the field.
Right. So they know not only, okay, this particular area needs this much water and it's going to get it, but they know that it did get it through flow meters or other sensors that might be out there. I'm guessing like soil moisture sensors maybe that show kind of the influx of water. Is that right?
Exactly. So soil moisture is a great one. And yeah, I forgot to mention that one, but that's a really big one. A lot of different types of soil moisture probes that we can integrate with. But when you look at bringing automation to a field, a really big thing for a grower is that, managing any additional technology on top of their already busy job, it takes some work, right? It takes some bandwidth. So if we can use automation to help reduce that bandwidth requirement for the growers, it really helps them to adopt that technology at larger scale.
Huh. Okay. Great. And I know I'm getting into the weeds right away here, but you're kind of getting to some of my question. I think it's good to paint a picture of exactly how this works, and then we can start to maybe zoom out and talk about the broader impact of it. So a little bit more on sort of how it works. How are you making decisions of where to put these devices? You mentioned satellite and climate data. Are you using like OpenET for that satellite data? Is this actual ET data, or are you using NDVI data for that? And then also, where's the climate data coming from?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so climate and ET data generally come from public sources. Then that's something that we're still building our models around. But the simplest that we use right now is basically satellite data, NDVI. So we get infrared imagery from Planet Labs most commonly. So they take images every day, 3-meter resolution, which is relatively high resolution compared to a lot of the other sources out there. And by taking NDVI, for example, we can look at the canopy growth across the field. So one of the ways that growers already use things like drone or satellite data is to look at, hey, like which parts of the farm have very high canopy growth, which sides have weak growth as well. So canopy is basically vegetation growth. And that's how they can assess basically, the overall holistic health of how their plants are growing. So in a lot of cases, for example, you'll see that, certain parts of the field, they look weaker than others. And that's where you might need to increase irrigation. But in certain industries as well, if you have too much vegetation, that can create higher disease pressure. And in wine, for example, in vineyards, it can actually reduce the quality of the fruit you're growing as well. So that's a case where growers actually want to reduce water use on a field in that case. So there's a lot of different applications according to how the grower wants to use that.
And is NDVI reliable for that? I've heard people kind of say, well, NDVI can be, you're looking at the result of a million different variables that go into that. And how do you know that it really is kind of a necessarily a water variable, or necessarily not just a water variable, but an irrigation application variable that's the problem?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, and that's a great question. And that's one that, we ask our growers about too. But generally the feedback that we get is that it's one of the simplest tools that they can use to assess their own farms. Like, even before we come on scene, like a lot of them already use NDVI, for example. And that's how they, assess things on the field. And I think it goes without saying as well that it's important to ground truth, what you see through data. So if we see something over satellite, we typically talk to the grower and ask, what's actually going on here? Because they do scout the fields, they understand their farms very well, even at, in industrial scale farms. So that's always helpful for us to understand, like, is the satellite data, actually meaningful for this particular grower with the way that they operate? And typically what we do see is that a lot of those differences are actually due to things like irrigation, or I think most commonly is the soil structure underneath the farm, because that really changes how water is retained.
And variable rate irrigation in these systems is not a new concept, and there are others that are either working on it or contributing to it in some way. Where did you see the gap of why it hadn't been commercialized to this point that you thought, okay, I think if Verdi can get this right, it really is bringing something new or something differentiated to the market?
Yeah, and I think the big thing, so variable rate was actually first conceptualized maybe around 20 years ago in the row crops industry, so broadacre like grain and cereals. So it's been developed there, and there's been some companies, and I would say some decent exits in that space as well, like Prospera, for example, getting bought out by Valmont Industries. But the big thing is that that's all broadacre, and so they're working off of infrastructure like center pivots, where you've got the single big machine in a field that can turn, and it's got power. You can set up networking on it as well. So the economics kind of work out in that case, right? And even there, I think there's something else I'll mention, which is adoption of variable rate within center pivot irrigated crops is only around 10% right now. So even that's still sort of steadily growing in size. But the real gap is where you jump to the high value crop market. So basically fruits, nuts, and vegetables. And you see that, well, there's no center pivots. Everything is operating off of these pipes and tubes in the ground that just kind of run everywhere. And there's no single place where you can put, a sophisticated piece of technology. You have to decentralize it and basically put it everywhere throughout the field in order to do variable rate. So we're basically bringing variable rate from, the broadacre side into specialty crops, which has a very different kind of setup. And that's something where, it hasn't really been done in this space before, at least not at commercial scale. It's been done in, research plots, but it's been very hard to actually bring to commercial operations.
And what infrastructure needs to be in place in order for Verdi's system to work? I mean, do you already need to have the valve automation? Do you already need to be collecting data in some other way? Or is it really just kind of like, we're going to come in, we're going to assess where the devices need to go, we're going to put them on and show you how to use the interface, and you're off to the races?
Yeah, it's more like the latter. So pretty much a grower just needs to have an irrigation system. And if they don't have an irrigation system, then I think they have, other things they can do before they use technology. But yeah, they pretty much just need an irrigation system for us to do variable rate on it. And there's actually different stages of automation that we talk to growers about as well. So we typically see that doing variable rate really is stage 3. But, once growers use it, they're like, wait, well, it worked at the subfield level. Can I bring this to every other, asset on the farm, like my pumps and my block valves as well, right? So that's really where we can use this technology and bring the other parts of the farm online and do automation there, so that growers can have, pump level, field level, as well as subfield precision of automation.
That's cool. What you said, stage 3. What stage 1 and 2? I missed that part. I'm sorry.
Right. No, all good. I don't think I said stage 1 and 2. So stage 1, I think, really is when growers just start using, sensors, for example, to collect data on the farm. So they start making more data-driven decisions. Stage 2 is when they start doing some preliminary forms of control. So like turning on a pump remotely even, or like turning on a block valve from their phone. So very simple things, but I think stage 3 here then is really, being able to go subfield and control like hundreds of devices in a field with just a few clicks of your finger.
So you started this in like I think 2019. I saw on your LinkedIn you like were stealth for a while. So did you like learn the stealth thing from X? Is that kind of where that's coming from, or what was the impetus for that? And then when did you actually launch with like a commercial ready product?
Right. Yeah. So the stealth thing was really that's just a project that we did with Google. So related in some ways, I think related in principle, but a bit of a different technology. But that's really where it was the project we did with them, and we did that for about a year. So that was 2019, and then 2020 was when we decided, hey, like there's some problems in this space that we should actually tackle for growers and just see if we can help them with. So 2020, we basically built the Verdi product, which was variable rate irrigation for specialty crops or high value crops. We went to the field for the first time that summer of 2020. We built the devices while we were still writing our final exams in college, which is kind of funny. But that was our first time with a product or a prototype in the field with actual growers. And I would say from then on to about 2022, even I would say early this year in 2023, a lot of that was R&D and really getting to a point where we can be very commercially mature with the product. Now that that's sort of out of that R&D phase and trial phase with growers, we're starting to see a lot of commercial expansions with growers in the US and Canada.
And talk about how you've kind of taken this to market. I read a couple articles that had mentioned that you work with food and beverage companies. So are you going through the food and beverage companies? Are you going direct to the grower? Are you working with any distributors? How are you handling that?
Yeah, so right now we do go direct. So we typically target usually enterprise scale growers. So when we talk enterprise scale, we really mean like the food or a beverage company itself. So in food, that's typically like they do some of the growing and they also, they do the marketing and all of that as well. And then in beverage, that's really, especially wine. We talk to the wine companies, they're vertically integrated. So it's from vineyard to winery to final sale. They manage all of that. So right now we do that because we find that in agriculture, it's actually quite tough to sell farm to farm. It's like there's a lot of farms out there. They're all different sizes, but if you can really target the larger ones, that's where you can get a lot more traction all at once. Their decision-making process tends to be more corporate as well. And I think that does help startups when they're just starting out. And if you do a good job, then there's a lot of opportunity to expand because they manage a lot of acreage. There's this kind of land of expand dynamic that you can get. So in terms of, where we've come now, we're working with a lot of these household names in food and ag. This past year, we've seen about 30x growth in terms of our traction. And we now have growers expanding to thousands of acres with our systems, some of them just putting it on 100% of their operations. So that's been really exciting to see.
And so those growers are the same people that every ag tech company, I think, would like to land, right? Sort of land and expand like that. That sounds really good. In practice, it's got to be a whole lot harder. So what's been helpful for you to actually reach key decision makers in there and get them to give you a chance? Because those are people that have to ignore a lot of those types of calls.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point. And I think for us, something that really helped early on was we started in academia to get these referrals and introductions to the industry. So that's how we first broke in. Once we got in there, I would say, agriculture is a big industry, but a lot of people know each other. And so if you can, make happy customers in one place, they will help you refer and, talk to other customers. And that's really helped us. So a little bit of this referral power, at least at the very beginning. And having that credibility is really helping us to, acquire new customers and also to expand with existing ones. I think technology validation is important, but also just having the trust of growers that, you work with them to fix problems and that you're there really for the long term is really important to get them to, refer you to new people.
Right. So that's great whenever you can get referrals. Obviously, any inbound business is really, really nice. But for outbound business that you have to earn, what are the early reactions or concerns that you hear from prospective customers when you say, look, I'd like to help, you reach variable rate irrigation through automation? What's their response to that? And give me the good, bad, and the ugly here.
Yeah, for sure. I would say definitely in the beginning, it's tough where especially let's say we approach a new crop type and they're like, well, so who else have you worked on this, with in this industry? And you're like, well, nobody. You're the first ones that, we're talking to. Right. So definitely there's that kind of trouble and that challenge, I think. But I would say, building up credibility with growers is still really important because those are the names that you can then use when you go to new customers and you show them, hey, well, we already delivered these results for, so-and-so growers out there. And these are growers that because of XYZ reasons. And so I think we've definitely found that even without the inbound referrals, like being able to say that, well, we've delivered these results for these growers on like a certain size of operation, basically a similar customer profile, that really helps growers to understand that, you actually are legit and that you can deliver value. So that's one aspect. I would say there's a few other things that you can really do. I think another one is really understanding that you shouldn't just reach the customer through one channel. Like often I think in the ag tech industry, you just go to industry conferences and you sort of wait there for people to walk by. I don't think we've had the best experience just, waiting for people to come by all the time, and you have to be proactive, right? And so you talk to one person in a company, but you might want to talk to, 3 or 4 different people at that company to really understand how it works and what's valuable to them. And once you understand what's valuable, I think that's when you can actually, make that sale into, hey, like, let's work together. I think a funny story from our end where one time we were looking through classified listings for, selling wine grapes, for example. And so we would start messaging people through their ads to sell their wine grapes. And we tell them, hey, do you want to sell, 10% higher yield, right? We can help you do that. So that's one kind of cold outreach method that we've used that, actually got some interest. I don't recommend it to everyone because I think there are more reliable ways to get, people and new customers. But that's one of the kind of fun hacks that we tried.
And when you're talking about, finding out what's valuable to customers, I don't want to skip over where the value is here, because even for some growers that cite water as their number one issue, I think they're citing a lot of times the risk of water availability, not necessarily the need for variable rate irrigation. So help me understand, where is the value? And I'm sure it differs from one crop to another slightly. But where's the value here, and where's the grower really experiencing the pain point where they're like, yeah, I need to try this. I've been thinking about this.
Yeah. And I think you hit that right on the head, because that's absolutely the case. Like, we talk about water running out for agriculture, or, people talk about that, but what they're really scared of is the risk, as you said, of not having enough water, right? It's not necessarily that water is going to be expensive right now, or maybe even in a year, but it's more of a long-term risk that they're looking to mitigate. So really, actually, that might be the way that you initially start that conversation, but typically the kind of buying decision really comes down to yield. So being able to improve yields by, 10 to 20%, especially for a company, let's say, that's making like $300 million or $1 billion a year, if you're able to increase their, top line revenue by, 10%, even, in certain farms, that's really big for them. So that's, I would say, the main driver. If you can save water on top of that, that's great for them, mainly as a risk mitigation. And, to some extent, the dollar savings as well. In addition to that, there's some, ancillary benefits. I'd say a really big one actually is labor as well. So being able to grow a uniform crop already helps growers to manage their farms better. They need to go out there and, harvest less, or they need fewer harvest passes, basically, because everything ripens at the same time. And if you, bring that technology to other parts of the infrastructure as well, then that means they're using less manual labor to do really basic things like just turning on a valve on and off.
And if I remember right, I thought for the wine grape regions, they want kind of optimal yield, not necessarily more yield. So when you're dealing with wine grapes, is that what it is? Like, oh, with more precision, I can reach optimal yield, not even more yield, but I want kind of like more in some areas, less in others.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually, that's entirely the case. So it really depends on a grower, of course. So sometimes they say, well, we want to manage yields, but we want more yields of this, target premium quality grade. So actually, one of our first customers, we helped them to increase the revenue per acre basically by 8% by increasing the quality tier of the wine that they were producing. And so that was really important for them because, that wasn't, necessarily a, volume increase in terms of the amount of wine they made, but they were able to sell at a higher tier, which is how they made their money, right? And that was really huge for them, especially when you're talking about a vertically integrated wine company that, they produce the grapes, but they also turn it into wine. So there's this huge sort of delta in the value of the product.
I do want to zoom out just a little bit and kind of talk about climate adaptation, climate mitigation in agriculture. It's kind of a hard subject because it feels in some cases very abstract, because it is. It's like it's having to think about the possibilities that might yet be to come, right? Certainly we see extreme weather events, we see droughts, we see fires, we see floods right now, but we really don't know on an individual farm level what types of risk mitigation strategies will need to be used based on what the future holds. So maybe let's just talk about how you think about, climate adaptation at the farm level and how something like Verdi can help.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think when we really look at, like, for Verdi, for example, we talk about our big vision. Like, in a nutshell, we're really looking at how can we make agriculture resilient to climate change by bringing, infrastructure automation to every farm in the world, right? If you look at the state of, even things like using a soil moisture probe or like using automation on basic farm equipment, the usage of that is actually relatively low, around the world. So if you can bring the benefits of that, to every farm, then you can really help to make that difference in terms of climate resilient ag. But then you ask the question, well, how do we actually do that, right? And I think, in the ag tech industry, there's often this kind of very technology centric perspective, which is, as long as we build great technology, then farmers will adopt and eventually we'll get there. We'll be able to, get it to every farm. But I think there's starting to be this kind of movement of people who are thinking, well, it's not just about building great technology, but how do you help growers to finance the adoption of that technology, right? How do you price it in a way that makes sense for growers? And even how do you help growers with the whole education and change management process that is required to really, do adoption? So if we dive deeper into that, like if we talk finance, for example, here at Verdi, one of the big things we do is we actually sell a subscription model. So we don't just sell everything up front. We sell a subscription so that growers can really pay this piecemeal and they can get, a positive ROI on it every year that they're using the product. So it's not like they're sinking all their money, into this product and then waiting for it to give benefits years later, but they just pay a, relatively low subscription fee and they can access everything that the platform offers. On top of that, though, we think that, right now you can get financing for tractors. I think that's super common, but can you get financing for irrigation equipment or even, a regular sensor on the market? That's actually quite different, right? You might have government grants that help you buy those things, but there aren't really options to, finance those through, more traditional means like your bank, right? So that's an area where I think, we're pretty interested in at Verdi. It's not something we're doing right away right now, but we think that it's something that would be beneficial for the industry. And then the other aspect here is, I think, the change management side. So a lot of growers, I'm sure you've seen this with new tech before, like growers will adopt new tech on like 100 acres or like maybe even 2 acres because they're trying it out. And then it takes years for them to expand to thousands of acres. And I think a big reason for that is because if you're putting it on just a small site, then it's easy to manage, right? You can get your most technologically literate, staff or team members to really manage that. But once you're rolling it out to thousands of acres, right, who's going to actually manage that technology? Who's going to use it? How do you make sure that all the members of your team, it might be 100 or 1,000 person organization, how do you make sure everybody understands how to use the technology in the right way? So I think for ag tech companies, it's also important that they think about how they work with growers to help train their staff and also to make it easy enough that anyone can use the technology without really having to spend a lot of effort and money.
Yeah, that's a big job. How has your team grown to try to attack some of those challenges? I know you said with the financing is something you're thinking about for down the road, maybe not doing so much right now, but in terms of that support and education piece, has your team really had to grow to handle that?
Mm-hmm. The kind of first thing for us is that every member of the team has to visit a farm and they have to touch dirt. They have to understand who they're growing for and how they're using their product in the field, because I think that really affects how you write code and how you build the product. So that's a big piece. I think support is a really big part of it, right? And it's often overlooked. It's not just about doing customer support, but it's really thinking about it as account management, where if you can provide really great support to your customers, that's how you can get them to really grow, because they know that they can trust you, they know you're here for them, and also they know that if something breaks, they can rely on you. Right. And I think that's what gives people the confidence to continue working with you. So, we had this debate before where, okay, should we really lean into new sales or should we lean onto account management? And we ended up doing account management because that's where we realized, hey, like, that's where we can create the most value for our growers. And for us as a company, if we can get really happy growers working with us, that's probably more valuable in the long run than getting all these new sales in the short run.
Arthur, this has been great. I really appreciate the time. Anything else you wanted to be sure to mention on the podcast episode before I let you go?
Yeah, I mean, you covered a lot, which is great. It was a really fun conversation. One thing I'll mention is that we really started in vineyards and orchards, but we actually do a lot of different types of crops now. So pretty much anything with a irrigation system and high value crops. So we also do berries, for example. We do fruits and nuts on trees, as well as even table grapes. So not just producing wine. So what we're really trying to do here is, we started in more of the high end of just, the wine industry, but we've really started broadening now into more commodity fruits, nuts, and vegetables. And eventually, we do see the possibility to go into broad acre as well and to, make variable rate even, more common there.
Very cool. Well, thank you so much for being on the show.
Yeah, thank you, Tim. It was a pleasure to be here.
All right, well, that is going to do it for today's episode. Thank you very much to Arthur Chen for being on the show. If you'd like to learn more about him, go check out their website, verdi.ag. It's verdi.ag. We'll, of course, link for it in the show notes. And right there on the website, you could see a couple of the brands that they're working with. I mean, notable names like E&J Gallo Winery and Wonderful Orchards. These are obviously large operations that are using this system. So very, very cool stuff there. Thanks again to Arthur for being on the show. Thanks as well to SwapMaps for being our quarterly presenting sponsor this quarter. You can learn more about them at swapmaps.com. Highly encourage you to do so. And last but certainly never least, thank you for your time and your attention. I never take it lightly. I'll be back next week with another story of ag innovation.